Dawn spread over Dustfall Ridge with the gentleness of a tired hand brushing across a fevered brow, painting the frontier town in colors soft enough to hide the cruelty it carried. Smoke curled from saloon chimneys, the streets still empty except for a few drifting tumbleweeds and the faint echo of last night's arguments that hadn't finished living in the walls. On the uneven wooden steps behind the Silver Lantern Saloon, Nayeli, aged 20, sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her long slim frame trembling under the weight of words hurled at her only moments before. No one chooses a native woman as a cook. Try the barns or the river camps, maybe they'll take pity. The insult still clung to her, sharper than the morning chill, and she folded her arms tighter around herself as if she could keep the humiliation from spilling out where anyone else might see it. Dust clung to her beaded dress, catching the faint sunrise like scattered embers, but the glow did nothing to ease the sting in her chest, nor the ache behind her eyes that threatened to spill over at any moment, though she willed the tears to remain hidden. In her lap lay a small beaded pouch, the only thing she owned untouched by the spite of strangers, and she traced its pattern with her thumb, wondering for the 100th time if she was foolish to believe she had any worth left to offer. Curiosity flickered through her mind. Why did she cling to this pouch as if it carried something more than memory, something alive? The air shifted, carrying the rhythm of steady boots crunching over dirt, and for one suspended heartbeat the world seemed to pause with her breath caught halfway in her throat. She did not dare lift her head, afraid it might be another voice ready to tell her she was not welcome anywhere at all. A shadow stretched across the ground in front of her, long and shaped by the sun at his back, and when she finally glanced up through a curtain of loose dark hair, she saw a man standing still as if unsure whether approaching her was wise or unwise. Colton Hartley, age 30, was a weather-worn cowboy with dust settling on his shoulders and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many nights awake thinking of losses he could not change. He cleared his throat softly, nothing sharp, nothing commanding, merely enough to see if she would acknowledge him. She wiped quickly at her cheeks, trying to hide the evidence of her tears, but he noticed anyway, though he pretended he didn't, which somehow felt kinder than direct sympathy. Instead, he asked in a voice low and steady, as if he feared startling her, "Are you the cook the Hartley Ranch posted for?" The question stunned her more than any insult had, because no one had hired her since she'd left her tribe's last encampment. No one had even paused long enough to ask if she could cook. A quiet beat passed before she managed to nod, her voice caught somewhere deep where doubt had taken root. Colton shifted his hat, studying her with an unreadable gentleness that made her pulse quicken, not out of fear, but out of bewilderment that a stranger might be speaking to her like she mattered. Curiosity stirred again, soft and persistent. Why did he speak as though her silence might break if touched too quickly? She rose slowly to her feet, and though her instincts screamed that trust was dangerous, she found her legs following him when he offered her a place at his ranch. As they walked toward his horse, she wondered if she was stepping toward salvation or into a different kind of humiliation, the kind that pretends kindness before tearing away hope. The Hartley Ranch rested at the edge of the valley like a tired guardian of too many lonely seasons, with wind-bent fences stretching out like ribs around a body long used to hardship. When Colton led Nayeli toward the porch, the boards creaked beneath their steps as if remembering footsteps that had crossed them long before. She took in the sight of the wooden beams softened by time, the hanging lanterns swaying gently in the morning breeze, and the smell of old pine and distant earth. Inside, the kitchen waited like a forgotten heart. Iron pots hung along one wall, flour dust lingered in the air like drifting snow, and the table carried scratches from years of meals eaten in silence. Nayeli touched the counter, her hands trembling slightly until she steadied her breath, reminding herself that cooking was something her mother had once praised her for, something she had been proud of before others crushed that pride under careless words. From the doorway, Colton watched quietly, not with hunger, not with expectation, but with relief, as though warmth had slipped into a home he hadn't realized had grown cold. She sensed there was something tender in the way his gaze softened, and curiosity brushed her ribs like a whisper. Had this house been empty of comfort for a long time? Her eyes drifted toward a carved wooden figure on the shelf. Simple, worn, shaped like a woman holding a basket, and she noticed the way Colton touched it with a familiar, almost reverent gesture, but he said nothing about it. She prepared her first meal, simple broth, warm bread, and roasted roots, and when she set the plate before him, she hesitated, unsure if she should stay or retreat to the corner like many cooks were forced to. Before she could decide, his eyes lifted toward her with gratitude so genuine it made her breath hitch in her chest. In the days that followed, connection grew between them not through words but through gestures stitched into the rhythm of mornings and night. Nayeli cooked with quiet skill, her movements gentle, her presence steady like a flame that never flickered too high. She mended fraying curtains, swept dust from corners forgotten, and repaired a loose hinge on the barn door with a determination that surprised them both. Colton, in return, left small tokens of appreciation without announcement: a polished new ladle, a neatly stacked pile of firewood, a bundle of fresh apples resting on the kitchen table. Their dinners were shared in silence broken only by the soft clink of spoons and the rustle of the evening wind, yet something warm and unspoken moved between them in those moments. Nayeli began to notice that Colton always avoided the West Room, locking it each dusk before retreating to his own chamber. Curiosity curled inside her gently like smoke rising from an unseen fire. What memory lingered behind that door, and why did he hide it from the light? She never asked, sensing that some questions sat like delicate glass, fragile and deeply personal. One night, thunder cracked across the sky so violently the windows trembled, and the candles flickered like frightened hearts. Rain lashed the roof, and a sudden branch slamming against the siding made Nayeli flinch so sharply she dropped the ladle she was holding, her breath catching in fear she tried to hide. That crash would pull them closer in a way neither had expected. Lightning lit the room in harsh flashes as Colton rushed to her side, his voice gentler than the storm outside. "You all right?" he asked, close enough that she could sense the steady warmth of him, grounding her trembling pulse. The storm rattled the house again, and he hesitated before guiding her toward the hearth where the fire still burned steady and gold. In the shifting light, his walls lowered just enough for vulnerability to slip through, and he told her that the West Room had belonged to his mother, a woman whose strength held the ranch together until illness took her before he could repay her sacrifices. Nayeli listened, her heart softening at the weight he carried quietly like a stone no one else could see. When he asked why storms troubled her, she admitted in a trembling voice that she had once cooked for her tribe during nights like these, and though they had praised her then, the settlers who came later ridiculed her skills, mocked her accent, and scraped away her confidence piece by painful piece. Her words fell slow and heavy, and for a moment, time seemed to shift around them, softening edges, blurring distance. Curiosity flickered across Colton's features when he opened his mouth, as if he were about to confess a secret reason he hired her. But after a second, he stopped, swallowing the words as though they weren't ready to be born. The rain softened to a hush, but something delicate and unnamed lingered in the space between them. A week later, Nayeli went into town to buy provisions, but the moment she stepped onto the main street, hushed whispers followed her like shadows that refused to detach. "Cowboy's getting desperate, hiring her," someone muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "She'll burn the place down." A woman selling corn looked her up and down with disdain sharp enough to cut. Humiliation pressed in until her breath felt thin, and when she returned to the ranch, she immediately began packing the few belongings she had, convinced she was bringing trouble to Colton's door. She folded her dress with trembling hands, her beaded pouch resting on top like the last piece of a life she wasn't sure she deserved. Colton found her in the middle of her quiet escape and, instead of demanding an explanation, sat down beside her with a stillness that spoke louder than words. She noticed then that his hands trembled slightly, not from anger, not from cold, but from something that felt like fear of losing someone he valued. Curiosity rose in her chest, tentative and soft. Could he truly wish her to stay? For a long moment, the only sound was the faint call of a distant hawk, carrying over the horizon. Then he finally asked the question that shifted the entire shape of her world. "Stay," he whispered, voice thick with sincerity. "But not just as a cook." The sentence stretched between them, fragile and hopeful, like a new thread spun across an old wound. He didn't reach for her, didn't force closeness. He simply watched her with breath held and heart open, waiting to see if she would let him in. Something warm unfurled inside Nayeli, something long buried and afraid to bloom, yet stirred now by the tenderness in his eyes. She reached into her beaded pouch, the same pouch she clutched in all her moments of fear, and curiosity flickered in Colton's expression as she loosened its strings. Inside, she held a small woven symbol of home, a tiny talisman of red and gold threads, crafted by her mother to guide her toward people who would see her heart rather than her skin. She placed it slowly into Colton's calloused palm, her fingers brushing his briefly. It wasn't a declaration, not a promise, but something deeper, a trust offering. He closed his fingers around it gently, as though holding something sacred, and his breath shimmered with awe in the dim light. Weeks later, the day of their marriage arrived with a sky softened by drifting clouds and air fragrant with sage burning in a small clay bowl. Colton wore his cleanest shirt, buttoned carefully despite fraying edges, and Nayeli wore a dress whose beadwork she had restored stitch by steady stitch. The ceremony was held beneath a cottonwood tree behind the ranch, where lanterns swung in the gentle breeze and a few elders from neighboring homesteads offered soft blessings that wove through the air like prayer threads. The grass bent beneath their feet as they spoke their vows quietly, not needing grand gestures when tenderness was enough to bind their promises. As they joined hands, curiosity sparked when Nayeli sensed someone watching from the tree line, the presence neither threatening nor celebratory, just waiting. When the vows ended and the wind carried the last whispered blessing into the open sky, the figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was an old ranch hand from town, a man who had once doubted Nayeli's worth as loudly as the others. His hat was held at his chest, humility pulling his shoulders inward. He apologized, not with excuses but with a cracked voice that carried genuine remorse. Nayeli listened quietly, absorbing his words like rainfall on long dry ground, realizing slowly that her dignity had not been granted by this apology but had been rising within her all along, built by every choice she'd made to remain gentle in a world determined to harden her. Colton slipped his arm around her waist, the gesture natural, protective, and filled with a pride he never tried to hide. When she looked out at the land stretching before them, fields rolling into distant hills, sunlight catching gold along the grass, she felt the child she used to be stirring somewhere deep, whispering of possibilities yet to come. Curiosity glowed softly in her chest as she wondered what kind of woman she would grow into now, with love beside her and strength within her, no longer shaped by others' scorn but by her own rebuilt spirit. The sun dipped low, turning the sky into molten amber, and while the world settled into quiet peace around them, one question lingered in her heart, shimmering with promise she could hardly name. And to you who listens to this tale across time's gentle divide, let me say this: worth is not found in the eyes that fail to recognize you, nor in the harshness of those who cannot see beyond their own fear. It grows in the tender spaces where someone notices your trembling and calls it courage, where someone sees the fire beneath your silence and refuses to let it dim. If ever you doubt your place in this vast, unforgiving world, remember the soft truth tucked inside Nayeli's journey: the right soul will recognize you even in dust and shadow. And perhaps your own story is only waiting for the moment when a quiet question changes everything.